The brothers themselves had spoken of purpose, of being refined, of joining others who had walked similar paths in distant centuries. This suggestion, that history held more cases unrecorded or purposely obscured, was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. If they were to be believed, the Blackwoods were not aberrations, but continuations of a lineage that ran beneath the surface of human history, surfacing only when conditions allowed. Still, even if such beings existed, the cost of becoming one was terrific. The brothers surrendered their humanity piece by piece. Hunger fell away, sleep thinned, emotions dulled, then sharpened into something alien. Their bodies changed, then failed. Their voices merged until they spoke as one. And in the end, whatever they were becoming required a final step, a shedding of flesh that did not sustain the transformation, only contained it. Their deaths were not killings, they were conclusions. The farm did not rebuke their passing, it absorbed it. The wheat grew unnaturally tall around Caleb's body. Josiah's books lay untouched, but felt charged with a presence that made visitors uneasy. Abel's faint glow lingered on the walls of the barn for days. The land seemed to hold the memory of what had happened, as though it recognized the brothers not as intruders, but as catalysts. The local Methodist church, which had once tried to embrace the brothers as shining examples of faith, wanted nothing to do with the burial rites. It feared contamination, not biological, but spiritual, an encroachment of something that threatened their doctrine. They buried the brothers quickly, stones set without scripture. A silence fell where prayers should have been spoken, but the mystery of the Blackwoods endured, because some truths resist burial. And as time passed, speculation grew. Some said the brothers died. Others said they simply shed bodies no longer needed. A few believed that the lights seen in later years were not hauntings, but continuations. 4 silhouettes listening to a frequency the living could not hear. What remains undeniable is this: the Blackwood brothers forced a question that neither science nor religion could answer. What is the boundary between life and death, between human and divine, between body and whatever consciousness may become when it unhooks itself from flesh? The brothers stepped across that threshold, and the world, unprepared, turned away. The truth, perhaps, is that some mysteries do not hide because they are weak. They hide because human minds are not ready to confront the shape of them. Some doors stay closed because what waits behind them would transform the one who entered. The brothers walked willingly into that unknown. Their story stands as a warning that transcendence may require a price our humanity cannot afford to pay. And yet, when the wind is still and the moon absent, travelers insist they have seen 4 figures in the remnant fields, faces tilted upward as if listening to a voice carried only on the most distant frequencies, a voice that speaks of things beyond the reach of the living. What do you make of their fate? Were the brothers taken, transformed, or did they simply step into a truth the rest of us cannot yet bear to understand? Share your interpretation in the comments. Tell me what you believe really happened on that isolated Kansas farm. And if you'd like more stories buried in the shadows of history, subscribe, tap the bell, and pass this tale to someone who hungers for mystery. Until next time, keep searching. Some truths wait for the brave. The case files were sealed. The Kansas State Medical Board made sure of that. Dr. Patterson's recommendation, absolute suppression, was accepted without debate. It was easier to believe that the brothers had simply died of the same fever that had claimed so many others. Easier to box the story into a category the living could understand. But memory is not so obedient, and Cedar Ridge carried its own private archive, the things seen but not spoken of. Those first months after the brothers' deaths were marked by quiet unease. Hunters walking the ridges near the farm claimed to hear faint singing at dusk. A ranch hand swore he saw figures standing motionless in a line along the wheat fields, only to find the ground empty when he approached. Children dared each other to run up to the chapel door at night, but none stayed long. Each one returned pale and shaken, saying the same thing, that something inside the stone walls was listening. In 1923, a development company purchased the land with plans for a new township carved from the prairie. Surveyors mapped the fields, drew clean angles where streets would run, marked plots where houses might someday stand. But the crews tasked with clearing the property refused to work anywhere near the chapel's ruins. Men who had swung hammers their whole lives found their hands trembling. One foreman reported that compasses and levels malfunctioned the moment they crossed the hill. Another worker collapsed with a sudden fever that lasted exactly 1 day and then vanished without explanation. Construction halted. The land, as though rejecting the intrusion, remained untouched. Eventually, the company abandoned the project and, with a mixture of frustration and relief, donated the acreage to the state. It was labeled a wildlife preserve. Officially, the area was closed to the public because of environmental instability. Unofficially, the locals understood the truth. Some places remain sealed because opening them invites more than curiosity. Yet the story did not end with the ruin of the chapel. The decades that followed brought scattered reports. Travelers describing 4 figures standing in fields where no man had lived for years. Hikers who heard voices threaded with strange harmonics. Campfires extinguished by a sudden pressure in the air, as though something unseen had passed too close. These stories were never written into law books or medical reports, but they lingered like a low, unending hum in the region's folklore. Meanwhile, the scientific world, which had once brushed against this mystery and recoiled, made no further mention of the Blackwoods. The few who knew the case details had retired or died. The files remained locked with government seals that no one seemed eager to break. It was easier, in the end, to let the memory fade than to admit what the evidence implied. That 4 men in an isolated corner of Kansas had crossed a boundary that modern science refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant rethinking the definition of life itself. Dr. Morrison, the man who had seen the brothers both before and after their transformation, never returned to Kansas. He lived out the remainder of his life in Oregon, practicing medicine with a calm, almost ascetic routine. Patients remembered him as gentle, quiet, unnervingly perceptive. He kept no journal after leaving Cedar Ridge. Those he had written during the crisis he destroyed with his own hands, watching his careful notes vanish to ash as if he hoped the fire would take the memories with them. But memory does not burn so easily. In his final years, he sometimes muttered in the dim hours just before dawn, speaking of golden eyes, of voices that layered upon each other, of a truth too large to bear. What the Blackwood brothers had become in those final months defied categorization. Not alive in the way a human is alive, not dead in the way a corpse rests in earth. They existed in an interstice, a suspended state where biology and consciousness intertwined. Their blood had been reorganized, their senses had widened, their minds had stretched past the limits of the human frame. And at the center of that change was a decision. Josiah's whispered prayer over a fevered child, the moment when he invited suffering to pass through the brothers like a tunnel through which something else might enter. Morrison, who had touched the edge of the brothers' gift and nearly been pulled through it, reached an inner verdict that split him. He offered the men two things at once: the scientific evidence in his notebooks and a personal testimony of experience that made no neat categories. He also offered them an impossible choice to make on his behalf: to shelter this new phenomenon and invite study that could change everything, or to suppress it and keep the world in ignorance. The town's decision, however halting, was hazard itself. The committee demanded that the brothers leave if they would not renounce their new state. What followed over the next weeks was a shrinking back. The brothers, who had once worked openly and walked through their fields like men entrusted with a secret, began to withdraw. The harmonies from their chapel fell silent. Light from those windows no longer pulsed across the prairie. Morrison, already ill with the fruit of what he had seen, a fever of the mind and body, made a choice that would mark him for life. He could not join them. The knowledge that had touched him had expanded his understanding, but left behind a voice that spoke like a razor at the throat of human sanity. He packed what he could, fled the region, and in the secrecy of later years destroyed much of his detailed record. Not everyone fled. Some stayed and watched. Winter descended as a thin, exacting thing. On December 15th, the first body was found in the chapel. Ezra, still arranged as if in prayer, skin parchment soft, eyes no longer golden but glass. No sign of struggle, no illness left to trace. The others were found in the following days. Caleb in the wheat, ringed by impossible stalks taller than a man. Josiah at his desk with a pen in hand and a blank page. Abel collapsed in the barn with a faint phosphorescent afterglow clinging to his skin like distant bioluminescence. The farm emptied of living motion. There were burials, quick and simple, stones set with names and dates but no causes. No autopsy was performed. Officially, typhoid complications were listed in record ledgers as the proximate cause. Unofficially, neighbors spoke of funerary rites hurried along as if proximity to the brothers might soil the living by association. The chapel fell silent and then into ruin. The site emptied of all but memory. Still, memory is a porous thing. Travelers passing on the old road swore they saw lights at the hill, heard harmonies on windless nights. Construction crews who tried to build on the land in later years quit in panic, claiming nausea and visions they could not place. Patterson's sealed report remained sealed. Morrison's destroyed pages lived on in rumor as a ghost of a scientist who saw too much and burned it to keep his mind whole. We have reached, for now, the place where official records end and rumor begins. A place where the practicalities of municipal governance met a phenomenon that had no category. In the last part, we will trace what happened to the farm, to the chapel, and to the idea that a human being might surrender himself into something that neither religion nor science can name without shuddering. We will look at what the suppression bought the public and what it cost the truth. When you are ready, we will open the sealed door and listen to the prairie one final time. What remained after the burials was silence, not the ordinary quiet of winter fields, but a kind that felt deliberate, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The Blackwood farm stood empty. Snow gathered on the chapel's roof, sifted through its cracked shingles, thinned the last traces of footprints. The wind that moved through the wheat stubble carried no song, no whisper of the harmonies that once reached across the prairie. Cedar Ridge tried, in its way, to move on. Families salvaged what they could of their grief. The town returned to its rhythms, births and harvests, Sunday sermons, the steady tilt of seasons. But underneath all of it lay a feeling that something unresolved still hovered at the edges of memory. When argument failed, the brothers offered a demonstration. "See and know," they said. Dr. Morrison, whose hands had stored clinical distance like armor, agreed. Professional curiosity and dread are twin things. Curiosity pushes you toward the cliff. Dread tells you to step back. He stepped forward. They called it a consciousness bridge. The term itself was not his. It was the language the brothers used. Clinical enough to soothe a scientist, mystical enough to frighten a minister. The procedure, so far as anyone could describe it afterward, involved no instruments he could recognize. They arranged themselves around the delegation and, with a motion like the closing of a book, something folded through him. For minutes that spanned what felt like an entire life, Morrison's mind unraveled and rewove itself. He perceived the town in a single, impossible sweep. The unvoiced grief of mothers, the secret longings of men, the minute stumbles of fortune that would become tragedies months from now. He felt, as if beneath his own ribs, a pattern of relation binding every household, every animal, every weather front. Distances collapsed into patterns of signal and reply. He saw events 3 counties away as if they were happening on the far side of an opened map. Knowledge came not as sentences, but as a brittle, crystalline sense. Too much and too precise for the human brain to take without fracturing. When it released him, he sat with his hands trembling and his face pale. Other members of the delegation were younger, harder men in some ways. Several staggered into the light and swore in voices ragged with something like awe. The bridge had shown them a unity that answered questions and posed terrible ones in the same breath. What they had seen did not resolve the problem. It reconfigured it. The brothers' abilities were not magic in the old sense, nor purely pathological. They were, as Morrison himself wrote later in pages, he would hide, then burn, an emergent condition that rewired perception and physiology together. Morrison's scientific mind turned to what he could measure. He took blood. He set slides beneath his microscope and described what he saw in the solitary, exacting language of a man watching his categories crumble. The cells were wrong. They were larger, organized in clusters with multiple nuclei. They moved with purpose. The fluid that flowed in the brothers' veins glittered like a new mineral, a substance that behaved less like blood and more like tissue engineered to think. To him, with his training in 19th century medicine, those samples read as life turned inward. "The blood is not merely life," he wrote in a hand that shook. "It coordinates, signals, decides. It is organism and mind in one." When he tried to publish, to consult colleagues he trusted in Kansas City and Chicago, the responses were thin and frightened. Some doctors suggested malingering mass hysteria or an obscure toxin. None could account for the way the brothers could heal a fever with the absence of measure, or for the way a child came from their chapel speaking of things no 7-year-old could know. Letters from Dr. James Patterson, the state medical examiner, described shock and then a decision that would seal the tale in official silence. Patterson spent 3 days on the Hill in late October. His formal report never saw daylight. The Kansas State Medical Board classified his notes and locked them away. If Morrison's pages were candid and trembling, Patterson's were colder, a professional's terror rendered in the exact grammar of administration. This cannot be allowed to propagate. Public order demands suppression. Years later, Patterson's private letters, found among his belongings, would confess a deeper horror. That what the brothers embodied undermined not only medicine, but the social order built upon classifications of life and death. As the officials debated containment, The social fabric of Cedar Ridge frayed. Children were found wandering at night in the fields around the chapel, limbs unhurt but faces changed, voices more measured, eyes taking on the same thin gold. Parents found their youngsters returned from short absences with knowledge they could not possibly have acquired. A girl could identify a mineral sample without having seen it before. Another could recite prayers in languages she had never been taught. Fear hardened into a demand for action. Dr. Morrison tried to measure. Thermometers and stethoscopes answered with impossibilities. Ezra registered 107 degrees and yet sat lucid and composed. Caleb's pulse at times thinned to near nothing. Josiah breathed in long, slow cycles that should have signaled cerebral catastrophe. Abel required less sleep, less food, but more and stranger awareness. Their voices, when they spoke together, came as one chord, 4 men in unison, precise as an announced theorem. The neighbors began to tremble between admiration and revulsion. Some thought a miracle had come to Cedar Ridge. Others, particularly those who had lost children, called it unnatural. Rumors braided together, skin that glowed like bones, voices that made ears bleed, children found in fields with strange wisdom. The Blackwoods worked their fields with the same care as before, but something new touched their movements, a coordinated economy, as if an unseen conductor guided them. Their chapel prayers, once private, spilled into the evening, and the sound that rose was beautiful and wrong in the same breath, harmonies no human throat should make. By the end of August, the town's fear had an edge of accusation. The rest of the story, the sealed reports, the delegation, the consciousness bridge, the disappearances, and the sealed graves, belongs to the next chapter. For now, remember the precise summer air and how a small farming town learned that the difference between salvation and terror can be only a single choice away. When you are ready, we will walk back up that limestone hill and listen to what voices remain. They convened a town meeting on October 25th, under a low sky that smelled of cold and the first hint of snow. Cedar Ridge filled the little hall with more faces than it normally held. Farmers in dirt-streaked coats, women with hands still red from threshing, men who had seen too much and wanted someone, anyone, to answer the questions they could not bear to ask themselves. The room divided along a clean, ugly line. Some saw blessing, some saw contagion. The debate ended not with reason but with an ultimatum. A delegation would go to the Blackwood farm. Mayor William Harrison, Reverend Marcus Thorne, Dr. Samuel Morrison, and Thomas Preston, father of the girl who had been found in the chapel. They would demand that the brothers undo what had been done or leave Cedar Ridge forever. They arrived November 1st, beneath a sky the color of old pewter. From a distance, the place could have been any homestead. Silos, a farmhouse, the stub of a windmill. Up close, the impossible details returned. The wheat fields stood unharvested and tall, forming strange alignments that suggested intention rather than error. Cattle grazed in patterns that made the hairs on the back of men's necks rise. The chapel on the hill pulsed faintly, as though lit from within by a dying luminescence. Sarah Preston opened the door. She looked like a child who had swallowed knowledge meant only for elders, alert, composed, eyes flecked with that cold gold. "They are expecting you," she told her father, and the harmonic undertone in her voice folded into the air like a tidal pull. The men followed her up the slope. Inside the chapel, the brothers sat. Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, Abel, arranged in a geometry as deliberate as a mortarboard. their bodies still human in outline but warped in texture and quality. Their skin might have been thin paper over something not bone. Their eyes were bright enough to hurt when you let them find you. Their greeting came not from one mouth, but from all four, as if they were a single instrument struck in 4 places at once. Mayor Harrison read the town's decision. The brothers, he said, must either restore their former state or remove themselves. The answer they gave was simple and absolute. The change was irreversible. They spoke of transcendence and continuation, of a path outward, not backward. Josiah, voice like multiple voices at once, argued that Scripture itself promised transformation, that humanity's telos was to outgrow the shells that bound it. Reverend Thorne, trembling, read passages of caution and humility from the pulpit, but found his words met by a calm that was not unkind. The first known case of typhoid in Cedar Ridge struck on July 15th. Mrs. Sarah Hartman woke well enough to open the general store, laugh with customers, set out the day's wares. By afternoon, she was delirious, dotted with the rose-colored rash that marked typhoid. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county physician just back from a difficult delivery, reached her before midnight. He was not a man to be easily unnerved, yet Sarah's fever was higher than any he had recorded in a living patient. She died just after midnight on the 16th, but the body did not obey ordinary death. Her skin took on a waxen pallor, her limbs stiffened too quickly, and her eyelids, despite every effort, refused to stay closed. Within a day, more cases clustered around the town well. Contamination seemed the obvious culprit. Runoff had breached the stone lining. But the disease moved with a cruelty that did not feel random. A German immigrant named Heinrich Zimmermann, stalwart and weathered, fell as if clipped in one day. In his delirium, he spoke languages no one recognized, words that scraped at people's memories like broken glass. Twin girls, Emma and Ellen Patterson, died together, their last syllables forming a prayer in a language that was almost Latin and yet not. By the first day of August, 14 were dead. All had succumbed within a day of symptoms, fevers so fierce they should have finished the body in hours. Delirium looked less like confusion than possession. Fear tightened its grip on Cedar Ridge. Homes were barricaded. The Methodist pews sat nearly empty. Dr. Morrison ordered the well sealed and the water boiled, but the pattern of deaths did not trace a simple contamination map. Entire households were taken while their neighbors stayed untouched. Logic faltered against whatever logic this fever obeyed. The Blackwoods watched at first, in keeping with their old habits of seclusion. Then, on August 10th, Josiah announced what he would later call a revelation. He told his brothers that their preservation was not for privacy, but purpose. They had been spared to be instruments. The next day, he rode to town to volunteer. His stated aim was to help Dr. Morrison. His secret aim, revealed only to his brothers, was more terrible: to invite the disease into himself, to bear what others could not, to test faith with flesh. His first stop was the Fletcher home. 8-year-old Timothy lay burning. Josiah knelt by the child, placed his hands on that fevered forehead, and spoke a prayer that was less petition than bargain. "Let the suffering pass through us," he said. "Let us take what others cannot. Let us be what is required." The child's convulsions subsided. The fever broke. Thomas Fletcher fell to his knees, certain of a miracle. But attention shifted away from the healed boy to the healer. Josiah's skin flushed as if he himself carried fever. At the corners of his pale blue eyes, flecks of gold moved like liquid metal. He stood with a precision born of someone fighting a rising current inside his own flesh. Dr. Morrison watched with professional concern and a private dread. Timothy appeared well. Josiah, within 48 hours, worsened. He walked house to house in those days, laying his hands and offering the same exchange. Take the sickness through us. People recovered in droves. At each bedside, a child inhaled air that smelled like wheat and old books, and then slept as if the fever had never been. But Josiah returned to the farm a different man. Fever high, delirium absent but not replaced. And when he spoke, he called what was happening a purification. The Lord, he said, burned away what was merely human to make something worthy. By August 13th, his brothers, Ezra, Caleb, Abel, began to mirror his symptoms. The transformation, once private and personal, became shared. Dr. Morrison made his first visit to the Blackwood farmhouse on August 18th. He found a farm that should have been dried to straw in the drought, yet the fields stood green, the cattle healthy as if blessed by rain. Inside, the brothers were arranged with a mathematical calm. Alive, they claimed, but altered. Ezra's skin had taken on a translucence that showed veins like faint rivers. The blood that flowed seemed to hold a light not of this world. His voice, the authority remained, carried harmonic overtones that settled in the chest of the listener and did not leave. Caleb's rose-colored spots had not the randomness of disease but the ordered geometry of equations written in flesh. Josiah's skin resembled parchment, covered in scripts that shifted under the eye. Abel radiated a soft, inner phosphorescence. His eyes had no pupils, only luminous discs. Each brother spoke of truths and revelations, of being instruments refined, of having moved past the categories that bound ordinary men. In the summer of 1878, when a fever moved through Harper County like a slow, merciless tide, 47 souls were taken. Typhoid, the physicians said, a grim arithmetic of infection and death. 4 brothers named Blackwood did not die. Their survival at first read like grace, a stubborn, inexplicable immunity that kept them walking while their neighbors vanished into graves. But the margin between miracle and monstrosity is a thin one. By the time winter wrapped the prairie in its cold, the Blackwoods had become a problem that science would not name and a congregation would not record. 3 physicians refused to write what they had seen. The Kansas State Medical Board quietly sealed the case. The local Methodist Church burned every mention of the family from its ledgers, as if ashes could erase what the living remembered in their bones. What began as an answer to prayer curdled into something else, a slow, obscene unmaking. Symptoms appeared that no medical manual contained, then shifted, became stranger still. Neighbors spoke of shadows that no longer fell properly from the brothers' bodies. Voices, when heard close, hummed with harmonics that left listeners woozy and sometimes bleeding from the ears. Their eyes caught light like the slit lamps of nocturnal predators. The last report, the one locked away and never to be seen, allegedly contained the line, "Subjects have transcended human biological classification," before the record itself was sealed. Nearly a century and a half of silence followed. Tonight we begin to pry at it. Cedar Ridge, Kansas, in the late 1870s, was not a place meant for mysteries to flourish. It was a crossroad of wheat and cattle. 300 souls amid a sea of prairie where the horizon kept its secrets and the wind had learned how to whisper. People there measured life by work and worship. Homesteads spaced like careful thoughts across the grass. Sunday meetings at the modest white Methodist with its bell that could be heard for miles. Hard winters and cruel summers had shaped a population into the image of endurance, God-fearing, practical, stoic. They read hardship as trial, harvest as blessing. The landscape itself seemed to encourage that logic. Miles of wheat, the occasional windmill, cottonwoods marking the shallow creeks. The sky, immense and indifferent, staged thunderstorms that made the prairie glow in brief, fierce flashes and winter winds that could freeze a man to death between barn and house. The Blackwoods arrived in the spring of 1872 with 2 covered wagons and an inheritance from Clinton County, Ohio. They bought 640 acres and planted a life. Ezra, the eldest at 36, carried quiet authority. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, hands scarred by labor, he moved like a man accustomed to being obeyed without asking. His eyes, pale blue as a prairie winter, unsettled people. Those who looked into them often felt as though he had seen through their faces to something they had not yet revealed. Caleb, 2 years younger, was the family's calculator. Ledgers, yields, the practical mind that turned faith into harvest. Josiah, 31, had the most formal education. He had studied a little at Ohio Wheaton University, theology, medicine, philosophy, natural science, and had shipped a crate of books to Kansas as if knowledge itself could travel by wagon. Abel, the youngest at 25, carried a fire of devotion that sometimes frightened those around him. He fasted. He wept in prayer. Some called him touched. Others whispered that his fervor approached obsession. They did not join the town's congregation. The brothers built a chapel on a limestone hill above their land. 30 by 20, hand-cut stone, oak shingles, walnut pews carved and smoothed by their own hands. Inscriptions in Hebrew that Josiah copied from his books were set on the altar. They followed a primitive Methodist devotion. Longer silences, stricter discipline, testimony of the Spirit, an insistence that God spoke directly and plainly to the individual. Their days were ordered. 4 a.m. prayer in the chapel, a day in the fields, evening study and prayer that ran late into the night. They were bachelors by choice. The house was plain, every room holding a well-worn Bible and Josiah's notes. By the summer of 1878, their farm had become a small miracle of its own. Wheat kissed the horizon, cattle fattened, the silo bellowed with grain. Neighbors respected them for industry and honesty, though their intensity unnerved more than a few. The brothers moved through town every fortnight with a precise, businesslike air. A list, a transaction, no small talk. Children liked to stare. 4 identical black beards, immaculate, as if the brothers had stepped out of Scripture onto the prairie.